This episode is brought to you by Fuli Gemstones.
Because it's called a university, a lot of people think that we should have classes. And we've talked about how to tier the knowledge, whether it's going to be for a novice or someone who is perhaps an appraiser or someone who is an expert. That might be a jewelry historian. So we decided we're just going to offer for everyone, and people are going to find their own path because we all are interested in something a little bit different.
I'm Carol Woolton, the voice of jewelry. Welcome to If Jewels Could Talk. I'm an author and broadcaster, and the woman who initiated the role of jewelry editor at magazines like Tatler and Vogue. This is a podcast for everyone, for people who do like jewelry, for people who don't realise they like jewelry, and anyone intrigued by fascinating facts, new ideas and forgotten histories. So join me as I tell sparkly tales and meet all sorts of people, delving into 4 centuries of jewelry culture and investigate what's happening now. Today we are tuned in to San Francisco, where I am delighted to say my guest is Suzanne Martinez, who is a gemologist, jewelry historian and curator. Since 1992, she's been with Lang Antiques Jewelers in San Francisco, and she is the woman who founded the Antique Jewelry University, which we're going to find out more about today and is a great philanthropic act for all of us who love jewelry. Suzanne, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
I wanted to know that when we've spoken before, I think you knew from a very early age that you wanted to work in the jewelry world. Is that right?
Absolutely. It found me.
And how did it find you?
Well, as a child, I lived on a piece of property that had all these big boulders, and they were embedded with small garnets. So I picked all the garnets out of all of the boulders and saved them. By the time I was 10, I was stringing beads, and when I was 13, I was lucky enough that high school I went to had a jewelry laboratory. So I started silversmithing, and the rest is kind of history.
How did you dig them out of the rocks, these garnets?
I think I just picked them out with my fingernails.
Oh my God, you can't have had any fingernails.
That was a long time ago.
Left.
I don't really remember.
Probably scissors and all sorts of...
Some little thing, absolutely.
That's amazing. So did you have a kind of family background in jewelry?
No family background at all. It kind of perplexed my dad in particular. It's like, why do you want to go into the jewelry world? Because he had no idea what it was like. And really, neither did I at that time. You know, when I went to GIA after college, I didn't realize the depth of the industry until I met so many people in my class that came from diverse backgrounds from all over the world. And that was kind of very eye-opening. One of the things that's really true about the jewelry business is it's multifaceted. I know it's very cliche to say, but it is.
So your parents were a bit surprised when you were kind of busting rocks at a really young age to dig out these garnets. They can't have imagined what you were doing or why you were doing it.
Oh, I don't know about the rock part of it, because my dad's mother was a geode collector. She and my grandfather used to go down to Mexico and collect geodes, and then she'd bring them home and cut them in half, and she had quite a collection. I guess I always had a little bit of fascination for geodes, but didn't have any personal. I didn't go to Mexico with her and collect, which would have been really fun at a young age, but that wasn't a possibility at that time.
But she talked about them to you, and you probably admired them when you visited.
Oh, yes. She didn't live that far away, but I was one of 4 children, and later another 2 added to our family, so we were a busy family. Kids didn't just go traveling like they do today with their grandparents.
So you started making jewelry, starting with these garnets that you dug out of rocks. What kind of, you were just making beaded necklaces?
Yeah, at first it was beaded necklaces. As a child, you don't have a lot of money. So I'd save all my whatevers, the babysitting money. And we had a great bead store in the town that I lived in. And I was just obsessed with beads for a little while. And actually, as an adult, I'm still a little obsessed with beads. I go to the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show every year, and I don't think there's a year that's gone by that I haven't bought beads. I have quite a collection.
And what do you do with them?
I had a line of bead jewelry. Let's see, that must have been in the mid-'80s that were really textural. They had multi-strands with all different colors and all natural gems. So I like the tactile feel of beads. They're beautiful. They come in so many different transparencies and colors.
Because you think of them as the sort of simplest part of jewellery, the bead, don't you? But it has this extraordinary history.
They're the earliest forms of jewelry that were found were beads, made of, I believe, shell beads go back more than 10,000 years.
So we think of them as sort of like these almost the simplest form of early jewellery, but actually they are hugely sophisticated and have this hugely sophisticated history.
When you think about these early beads too, how did they drill them?
Yeah.
What was the technology? Where they didn't have technology.
So they were like you. They were using their fingernails, probably. So you went on to study gemology.
I did. I went to the Gemological Institute of America. At the time, they had a campus in Santa Monica, California. Now it's in Carlsbad, and it's a large campus. And it was a nice, small, cozy campus, and it was right next to the beach. It was a lovely time, and I was absolutely hooked at that point. I'd already taken some GIA courses through correspondence. I'd started the Colored Stone program, and I just realized that I needed to do it in person. I needed to go and be exposed to a far greater variety of gem materials than could be provided through a correspondence course. And in the GIA program when I was there, they had boxes, and the boxes are filled with stone papers, and probably maybe 100 per box. My obsession was to go through every box for every class, and I did. But it was a great opportunity. And back then, when a dealer would come in, I'll never forget this one man came in, and he was a Japanese dealer, and he brought in a piece of jade that looked like an emerald, and it was the finest piece of jade I may have ever seen in my whole life.
Wow.
So we had these opportunities by being at GIA that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
And then you have a benchmark of having seen the finest piece of jade you think you'll ever see. So you have something for the rest of your career to compare it with.
And I think that's one of the things about being a gemologist. You have the tools to learn how to grade things from high to low. I mean, that's part of what we do. Even today, and with myself and my colleagues and people that I'm teaching, look at this stone and tell me on a scale of 1 to 10 what its quality is and why. You have transparency, you have actual color, you have saturation of color, and cut is very important, and where it falls in the scale of that particular gemstone. I mean, there are some gems that are always going to be included and always going to be translucent versus transparent.
And did you develop a particular favoritism for one stone over any others?
Well, emeralds have always been my favorite stone. And second to that is anything orange.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. I like orange garnets very much. And there's all different colors of orange garnets. That can be a hessonite garnet that has a little bit of brown to the stone. It can be a spessartite that can be super orange, almost fluorescent orange. And kind of everything in between.
And the fire opals?
Oh, fire opals, absolutely. And they tend to be a little bit translucent. They're not a clear crystal. So that adds another little nuance to the stone.
So do you think what has absorbed you, is it led by the stones or the jewellery? Which really do you feel that it's led you in your career?
It started with the stones, and now it's the jewelry. But it's a combination of both. I mean, the jewelry has to have a great stone in it, or the stone has to match the piece of jewelry. It can't be an Edwardian ring that has a Madagascar sapphire in it, because something's been changed. Because Madagascar, the mines that are, finding new sapphires probably are 20, 25 years old. So that's something that a lot of people aren't aware of. That really has to be looked at. We see that all the time at the store. We buy jewelry that we look at it and we disclose it if we find that it's a marriage of some sort. It doesn't mean the jewelry's not beautiful still.
People have to know what they're buying.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess it's just that years of experience honing your eye that enables you to notice these things.
It's on my mental checklist, When you do it for a long period of time, you just kind of automatically do things. Everything goes to the microscope. And we send a lot of gems to laboratories, too, because we want to make sure there's some things we can't
have a second
tell.
opinion.
Absolutely. And our customers want that as well.
So what led you to Lang Antiques?
It was something I had been appraising jewelry for more than 10 years, and I'd appraised thousands and thousands of pieces of jewelry, all different kinds of jewelry, historic and not historic. And this was back before the age of the computer, and there was no Google. So researching meant you had to have a library, and you had to have books so you could find information, and you had to know people that knew more than you did. So you've created your business differently than we would today. And when I started being associated with my partner now, Mark Zimmelman, I used to buy in jewelry. I lived in Hawaii. I had a business in Hawaii, and we bought a lot of jewelry from the public and through our appraisals, through jewelers that we worked with. And Mark was one of the places I sold to because he and his father had an estate business in Los Angeles. So I knew when I saw something kind of what it was based on my library, but I did not have a breadth of knowledge at all. So he bought Lang Antiques, and he said, you have to come work in the store. It's fascinating. You'll love it. So I said, I'll come a couple days a week. And that's how I started, because I didn't want to let go of my appraisal business, which I loved. And my daughter was like 2 years old. So I really got fascinated, and I just had a voracious appetite for learning. So I just bought every book that I could, and this is kind of what led to AJU, is the books that I really learned a lot from had a glossary-like either section, but they were, what is a chatelaine? It's not like you're going to read a chapter in a book about chatelaines, but there's a little, an entry about chatelaines. You start seeing this over and over in books, and you get a really good idea of what a chatelaine is. And seeing them in person, that's just as an example, but everything was like that. So I started keeping track and writing my own descriptions. And when we started our website, we decided to put a glossary on the website, and it was about 1,000 words by that time. So that started Antique Jewelry University, that 1,000-word glossary.
So then how did you progress with it? Did you keep adding to it? Did you employ people to add to it? Because it's very detailed.
It is. So it's a combination of things. In the early part, I was responsible for the content. I also befriended Christy Romero, and Christy was a jewelry historian here in California. She was in Southern California. And she actually taught jewelry history at a junior college level, which was like pretty amazing that would have even been available to anyone. And she did lectures, she did symposiums. So I attended a couple of her symposiums, and she had a timeline that was kind of like a glossary. In other words, at this point in time, this was patented, and she looked up all the patent numbers so that she knew that this clasp was made in 1901. This clasp was made in 1907. So her timeline was very specific. And unfortunately, we lost her to cancer. And before she passed, she gave me her timeline to add to Antique Jewelry University, which was a great boon to content, because it was a place to start for us to take content of, what about this patent? Should we talk about patents and how they affected the manufacturing of jewelry and how to date jewelry? So it was a great collaboration between us. And it enabled Antique Jewelry University to really move forward. Mm-hmm. We hired a woman by the name of Mary Borchert, and she does a lot of our writing. We started Antique Jewelry University as a wiki, because our concept was, I'm not the only one that is interested in antique jewelry. Christy was clearly interested. I met a lot of people through Christy where they were clearly interested. And I thought we would all contribute content. It never happened. Mm-hmm. No one contributed content.
And what did you intend at that moment for it to be? You couldn't have known it would be such a big digital resource at the time for people.
I had no idea it was going to be the resource it is today. But the original, homepage was a library. So it was a library of books, which was the concept. Here's a source that's kind of encyclopedic. That's what I wanted it to be. Encyclopedic, and it's like any encyclopedia, you can continue to add information to it.
And it is, the breadth of what is covered is extraordinary. I'm just written a few down: maker's marks, jewelry identification, famous jewelers, history of jewelry, gems, rocks, minerals, gemstone shapes, terms and tools, diamonds, famous diamonds, simulants, terms and definitions, how to wear, how to shop. It's like the one-stop place if you want to know more about jewelry. And I'm sure a lot of people who listen to my podcast, maybe they've discovered it, and if they haven't, they certainly will after this podcast.
Interesting, the most visited page is the maker's marks. Because
is it? So you've got
people are
jewelers
researching. They want to find out if they have a piece of personal jewelry. They want to find out who made it. It's an obsession of people. I get emails every day. Do you know this mark? Can you help me identify it? This is my mother's. We want to find out who made it. And we can't always do that. And it's not really a service that we provide, but we provide the website, which has all the marks that we've researched are on there. So we have them scanned, so you have a good image. If we have photographs of them on the actual piece of jewelry, we include actual photographs. Many companies have multiple maker's marks, so we'll put as many as, we come in contact with. Sometimes people share them with us. I work with a lot of people in the auction world, and they share maker's marks, which is really nice. But it enables people to find out more about Antique Jewelry University as well and dive a little deeper.
So what did you think would be the most visited?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, I would say if you were a novice and you wanted to learn about antique jewelry, you need to learn about all the decorative periods, Georgian and Victorian era, Art Nouveau and Edwardian, Art Deco, all the things that we know. That's what I would expect people to want to learn first.
I suppose you've got people of different knowledge looking at it, because if you've got a jeweller who wants to learn about maker's marks or has got a piece in and they want to understand where it's come from, or you've got somebody wanting to learn about stones, you might have hobbyists who are just interested in jewelry. So you've probably got all sorts of different types of people using it.
We do now, absolutely. But we did start with the basics. And, because it's called a university, a lot of people think that we should have classes. And we've talked about how to tier the knowledge, whether it's going to be for a novice or someone who is perhaps an appraiser or someone who is an expert. That might be a jewelry historian. So we decided we're just going to offer for everyone, and people are going to find their own path because we all are interested in something a little bit different.
Have people asked you for classes?
Oh, people think that we might offer classes, and we do get that request occasionally, but we don't have classes. One of my employees is also a friend and a colleague, and we teach, at different conferences. We'll go and do a 1 to 2 hour, and mostly we'll do a hands-on. We'll actually bring, for example, how to date diamond rings, antique diamond rings, which there's so many reproductions. How do you tell the difference between an authentic ring and a reproduction? And the reproductions are so rampant now that it's gotten harder for me, even. But we have very specifics that here's this ring, this is what you're going to look for when you see it. We set up microscopes and really teach people how to do the dating.
Reproductions of the creation of the ring.
It is the way the ring is made typically. The diamonds, for example, a lot of the reproductions, they use contemporary European cut diamond melee. So the small stones have characteristics. They typically have an open culet, which is really found in a larger European cut, not a small European cut. So in authentic jewelry, the culet usually comes to a point on the bottom of the stone, sometimes a little bit open, but typically it comes to a point. Whereas in these reproductions, the small stones have an open culet. There's a facet there. So that's a key. And they all look the same, and they're all cut exactly the same. Old jewelry, the diamonds are hand cut. They're a little irregular. They're not perfect.
And what about the lab grown? Do you see that coming into some antique pieces as well?
I know it's there, but I haven't seen it personally yet.
Okay.
Definitely know it's there because I had a colleague recently tell me that someone that he knew was buying old mountings that maybe they were sold for gold. So he would go to the gold refiners, buy their scrap rings, the rings that were salvageable, and then recut synthetic diamonds the lower quality that have inclusions that may not be obviously synthetic, and recutting them in a European cut proportion and setting them in these rings. So buyer beware.
Yeah,
It's really going to be tricky going into the future.
It's a case of keeping the technology up to date to keep pace with the sort of the good guys and the bad guys. So they both need this technology. The bad guys can make it happen, and then you need technology to find it and notice it and track it.
Well, we use a lot of outside laboratories. We send any diamond that we sell that's a carat or over, we get a GI lab report on it, unless it would destroy the mounting to take it out. For example, a very, very delicate Edwardian mounting, because a lot of the diamonds are set in a bezel, very, very delicate bezel. And you can't really recreate that properly, so we'd never take it out. But everything else we send.
That's a lot of work has gone into that. It's very selfless of you. Most people would charge, Suzanne. Do you realize that? Most people would now have set up a paywall and say, you pay, guys.
And that's something that may happen in the future. Okay. But for right now, we're not charging. We thought about perhaps the hallmarks, because a lot of people that are using that, looking up maker's marks and hallmarks, are professionals. They're using it for their advantage. And those people are the ones that, maybe they could help us pay for it. But right now it's still free.
And you just run it on the back of the business.
Yeah.
I tell you one thing I really, really like about it is the timeline. The idea of what was happening in the world to inspire the designs at the time. It talks about inventions, events, discoveries, technological innovations. And I think that's really nice to have that alongside so people get a greater understanding of the time in which the jewel was created.
We even there's a couple of videos on the website too that are really interesting, because they kind of cover that as well. What was happening in those times socially? And that's part of jewelry history.
Because, of course, fashion has such a huge influence. These things have to be made and worn in conjunction with what people are wearing.
But, it's not just that. It's like, women became emancipated at circa 1900. That's why we have the Art Nouveau. In the Victorian period, women were depicted in jewelry and a cameo, kind of very buttoned up. And then look at Art Nouveau jewelry with these beautiful naked women with flowing hair, and it was a whole different thing. So that was reflected in the clothes at the time as well. It's all tied together.
So do you use the Antique Jewelry University yourself?
I do.
You do?
Yeah.
It's hard to remember.
And I would say especially the timeline, because there's so many little details in there that I'm constantly going back and referring to. Sometimes it's just, in my mind, I'll think it's 1865 and it's 1866, and I just want to get it straight. And
you study yourself Latin American cultural anthropology. Mm-hmm. So that's something that's interested you for years. Does that overlap with your interest in jewelry?
Well, I make it overlap.
Okay, yes. And how do you do that?
I did an art history course, a Latin American art history course, 10 or 12 years ago. And I did a presentation for the class where I took all the motifs from the period and the jewelry that was found in a lot of the archaeological ruins. And then I showed how Spratling used all those same motifs in his jewelry. Spratling was a jeweler who established a atelier in Tasco in Mexico. And it's a tiny little mountain town. And he was an American, and a lot of expats were there during the World War. This was actually, he started in, I think, 1935. But many jewelers ended up in that area that he helped establish. And it became, the Tasco School of Jewelry, basically. We could give a whole class and talk a whole...
This is mainly sort of silver, turquoise, that kind of...
Primarily silver jewelry more than even set with stones. And I would say one of the stones, turquoise wasn't used that much, but amethysts were. Amethyst, I think, was one of the main stones that was used. Black onyx.
And what's the design of it?
Well, I think a lot of the motifs are ancient motifs that either where they're from. Aztec motifs or some of the other Native Americans from Mexico. I just was very interested in Latin American cultural anthropology when I was in college. I used to travel to Mexico a lot and go to ruins and I just love the culture. When you go to Mexico City, you have ruins that are out in the open in the middle of the city. You have colonial times, so you have colonial buildings, and you have very contemporary buildings. Legoretto is one of the designers, and he did art installations and buildings, and just incredible. And they're out in the open for people to see. So it's part of the culture, and I really like that.
Sadly, I haven't actually visited Mexico City, but of course I'd love to go to the Frida Kahlo Museum. She had quite a strong jewelry look herself, didn't she?
Absolutely. She liked pre-Columbian beads. She always wore these necklaces that were heavy in beads. I know that when she was younger, she wore jewelry that I think was her mother's that looked like it was very much Spanish in origin. Filigree, dangly earrings.
She was very determined to take that Latin American culture to the rest of the world, wasn't she?
Very determined. I mean, she wore Tijuana clothing. So she wore a huipil type top that was embroidered with flowers with a long full skirt. That was typically her dress. So she definitely adopted the native culture as her dress.
And wore it proudly when she went to the US or anywhere.
And no one else did that.
It's amazing when you look at her now, that image that obviously is everywhere and it's obviously been used.
I don't know if you can see it. I have to get my...
Oh, you've got a picture of her in the background, Suzanne. That's so funny that I brought her up. Suzanne's just rushing to get the picture off the wall to show me. Oh, it's the book, yes.
But look at the jewelry.
Yeah. Was that the one at the V&A Museum?
No, this one was in San Francisco.
Oh, that was San Francisco. I mean, incredible. And just that strong look that looks so modern at the same time.
She was ahead of her time.
And she knew the projection of the image and how to make the image make her happy. I think a lot of it was about her own identity and how she felt about herself, wasn't it?
Well, this is what I love about jewelry is you can find this everywhere. I mean, everyone identifies with jewelry. Every person I've ever met, it's very rare that someone doesn't wear jewelry. And I think if you go back historically in time, I mean, way back to that 10,000 years ago when people were wearing shells, from there forward, I think we became human at that point when we started actually identifying, because that's individuation. This is who I am versus who someone else is, by how we adorn ourselves.
And I think actually the simple stringing of the beads or the shells, however they did it, archaeologists would say it shows organized human behavior, and that is the first sign of it. You obviously love Latin American culture, but what's your personal favorite period of jewelry?
I really like Art Nouveau. I think that's a time period where there was so much change, and it started, with exhibitions in the late 19th century, where people became aware of other cultures. Japan was now open to the world, where they had been closed, before, I can't remember the exact date, but it's around 1850. And once Japan became open to the rest of the world, those design elements had never been seen before. The simplicity, that just a nice little line that's curvilinear in water with an iris. That's a classic Japanese motif. And you have that, and how did that become interpreted in Western jewelry? And it happened over a period of time. You had Samuel Bing was an art dealer of Japanese art, and he was the one that started the Art Nouveau gallery in Paris and helped organize the artists that did this new style, new art, for the exhibition in Paris in 1900. So all of those things kind of flow together. It's not just one element that created the Art Nouveau period. And then you have all these incredible jewelers and the techniques that they used. Plique à jour is just fabulous. And I know it was done before the Art Nouveau period, but it was really done well then.
But it's quite an interesting time where there are so many different styles feeding into that period, aren't there, around 1900?
Yeah, I agree. I talk about this all the time in the store because everybody wants to put a period name on something. Not everything's Art Nouveau just because it was made in 1900. You have the Victorian influence, and you have early Edwardian influence, and you have...
Which is so different because you have this this whole diamond, really, really beautiful and delicate, but it couldn't be more different to Art Nouveau, could it?
Actually, people still, I'll take a Boucheron, or they didn't do Art Nouveau jewelry in yellow gold and plique jour, but they did take those same motifs and do them in colored stones and diamonds. I've had pieces that had gorgeous whiplash lines, all platinum, all diamond set.
Almost like the garland style, trying to get to that curvy, linear way using diamonds.
Yeah, so you see a lot of overlap.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. Mm-hmm. I've always seen them as very contrasting.
But people still wanted the new style, but they wanted it traditional. They weren't laliques. They weren't, super creative, innovative. So they were very traditional. So there was a place for both of them.
And then do you see the arts and crafts as very attached to Art Nouveau?
I think every country was going through, a new way of creating art and jewelry. And in England, it was arts and crafts. So there's definitely an overlap, but I think the jewelry looks very different.
Because?
It's restrained in a different way. It's more, the theory was everything was handmade, everything was going to be functional. Where Art Nouveau, you had artists that were at the top of their game doing incredible work. So the two are very different, in my opinion. But they came to it the same way. They wanted change. There was change in culture. In arts and crafts, you had whole communities that embraced the arts and crafts. They made everything by hand. They lived in a commune type environment. But the arts and Art Nouveau wasn't that much so much. It was more individuality in the jewelry.
I also think of arts and crafts as slightly rougher in appearance. It didn't have that perfect quality to it.
Much more of a handmade look. And a lot of them were not, the people that made it were not trained as jewelers. The later arts and crafts, yes, became more refined, but they weren't trained as jewelers. They really were learning as they went.
And the garland style was possible because of the use of platinum, wasn't it?
It's interesting. If you look at late Victorian jewelry, there is a lot of influence. It started with silver over gold before it was all platinum. Very similar, garlands and swirls and same motifs. They had a place where they began, and it was still in the Victorian period. But platinum, because we didn't have platinum, well, we had platinum, but it was the early use of platinum typically was fused on top of gold, and you didn't see a lot of it until the oxyacetylene torch was more available, which meant we had to can oxygen and acetylene in order to create pressure, to create enough heat to melt the platinum. But also platinum was just, it has a lot of tensile strength. So you were able to do these tiny, tiny knife edges and have strength in the piece of jewelry. We have rings from the 1910 to 1920 period. They were made with a thin shank. They still have a thin shank, and they don't need to be reshanked. It's still as strong as it was, and people have worn it for a lifetime.
Wow.
Yeah.
And also there's lovely sort of webs, spider webs of jewelry that were possible because of the thin aspect of platinum.
And it's really interesting after seeing a lot of those over time. There were two techniques used to create those webs. Sometimes they would use little tiny pieces and they would assemble them all together. There's a lot of these really filigree, lacy pieces that were made in the Edwardian period. There were two different ways they made them. Sometimes it was made where they took a sheet and they sawed it all out. Can you imagine making lace with a little saw blade? I can't even imagine how they did it, but I can see visually by looking at it with magnification that that's how it was made. And sometimes they took those little tiny pieces of wire and soldered them all together. It's an amazing feat. I don't think anybody could ever reproduce that jewelry again. And I don't think anybody wants to take the time to learn to do it either. These workshops had someone that just did engraving, that probably did all the mill graining on each piece. I don't know that will ever come back. And, the jewelers work in CAD, and I have a friend who's a CAD designer, and he keeps telling me, get used to it, because that's how all jewelry is going to be made. And I'm like, no, I like handmade jewelry. I'm always going to like handmade jewelry.
So innovation is important in jewelry. How often do you think a big innovation comes along in the world of jewelry that changes the way it's made.
Well, speaking of changes, I think the CAD has made a big change in jewelry, and that's why people aren't hand-making jewelry anymore. But I would say the turn of the century, around 1900, steam power and these steam engines. For example, in Providence, Rhode Island, in the United States, became a big jewelry center because it was a big manufacturing center. The technology was there, and the jewelry industry adapted that information. You know, they had die striking machines and the oxyacetylene torch and all those things. So that was a very important period of time for change, in my opinion.
Which was the death of Art Nouveau itself, wasn't it?
Well, it's interesting if you look historically to see. You know, I like to look and when were gemstones found and how did that affect for, you know, Alexandrite? When was it found? And demantoid garnets and all these things, they became available and start being seen in jewelry. So you can date things that way. But as far as the manufacturing techniques, I think a lot of them have been very similar for a long period of time.
What was happening in 1900 that you think sparked these incredible stylistic movements?
I think it started in 1850 with the world fairs, because the innovation for people learning of what other people were doing all over the world, whether it was artistically or technologically, I think that started a big shift. You know, there was a lot of industrialization that happened around that time period, and people rebelled against it, you know, because technology meant everything was the same. Everybody was doing the same. People were going to a factory and working. You know, we lost those craftsmen that were doing mill grain on fine jewelry. They did that in the Victorian period, still had fine beadwork in some of their jewelry. And it was all, an engraver did that part of it. You know, look at these beautiful watch cases that were all hand engraved. You know, all by guilds, craftsman guilds. And those all started going away with industrialization. So I think it was a backlash against that. And Victoria really set the stage for the world style for so long. And she was in mourning for 50 years, 40 years. And you know the date better than I do. But her mourning period just put a damper on everything. Everything had to be black and
no color.
No color.
So it's no wonder that white garland style came.
People were ready. In Art Nouveau, they were ready for change. And I think that happens historically around the turn of a century. I don't know why, but whether people expect something to happen, like our Y2K, everybody thought something was going to happen, even though it didn't. But that was the age of the computer. And that kind of technology really changed things in 2000.
Changed everything.
Yeah, changed everything. So there was another big change. And these shifts, I don't know whether it takes 100 years for a big shift to happen, but there definitely was a big one in 1900.
And those big shifts of change do propel innovation and, I think, creativity.
And whether someone is going to wear a Lalique brooch or not, or they're going to see somebody when they go to the Ballet Russe in Paris wearing something like that, or they're going to see Sarah Bernhardt wearing this fabulous jewelry when she's acting, that stimulates people to doing something of their own, whether they're doing it on that scale or not. I think it opened a lot of people's eyes to, you know, that they didn't have to wear black anymore. They didn't have to, you know, be traditional. A lot of changes started at that time period. I mean, women started playing sports and riding bicycles.
Smoking. Or a bit later they were smoking.
I think they started smoking earlier.
Yeah, all kinds of things. Dropping corsets.
I can't imagine ever wearing a corset. Ugh.
Well, I don't know. A lot of people paid Vivienne Westwood a lot of money to be put in a corset. So what's going to happen in the future? What's coming?
Well, unfortunately, the synthetic diamonds have been, I think, a real negative to our business.
Yeah,
and,
I think so too.
I mean, beautiful old hand-cut diamonds are just, and they're all one of a kind and very beautiful. But contemporary diamonds are, and a synthetic diamond, if they have an excellent, a triple X cut, they look the same. It's the beautiful old jewelry that's handmade to me that has, or jewelry that has designed. Good design is always good design. I mean, you've seen a lot of jewelry. You can see good jewelry. We have a lot of people in the world. Everybody wants to have a piece of jewelry today. So how do we accommodate that? Not everybody gets to have a fine antique or a handmade piece of jewelry. You always wonder what gemstone is going to be discovered, because there has been so many discoveries. I mean, look at all of East Africa in the last 30 years, all the beautiful stones that have come out of there, all the fancy colored sapphires and tanzanite and the Paraíba tourmalines that came out of Brazil. What's the next gemstone find going to be? That's different, that's unusual. I look forward to things like that.
So we wear very differently now, as you say. We can't wear it out. Maybe we have to be more casual. So when was the last sort of great formal jewelry moment, do you think? Was it the 1900, or do you think it was as late as 1950?
Oh, definitely in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. I think people were able to wear fabulous jewelry. There were more events. I mean, even today, as we know, there are remnants. I mean, people still go to the opening of the opera and, wear fabulous jewelry. And
not here, they don't, I'm afraid. It's very dressed down here.
Really? Even for the opening of the opera?
Yes.
Wow. Well, here in San Francisco, I went a couple years ago, and everybody was quite elegant. It was really fun. I got to wear lots of jewelry.
So do you take it out of the store and just wear what you have for the...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So what did you wear that night?
Oh, I had this collar. It was a big fringe, and it looked kind of like an Egyptian collar, but it was all gold fringe. That was the most important thing. It was very dramatic, and my gown was, gold brocade, so it was just, that was really fun.
And when was it made?
Probably the 1940s or 50s. Mid-century.
So do you think there is a style now, a definitive jewelry style now?
I don't think so.
How would you describe it on Antique Jewelry University then, our moment? Or will you have to wait for a few years to identify it?
We have to wait a little bit for it to settle out. I see a lot of young people want, a teal-colored sapphire from Sri Lanka. And I think one of the things that's happening in our industry is people are working direct with the public. For example, a mining company is selling direct to the public. People are going direct to the designer to make their jewelry for them, rather than going to a retail jeweler and finding things in that jewelry shop or working directly work with them. So I think there's a shift happening right now in how people are buying their jewelry. Maybe they're getting more closer and more intimate to what they want and personalizing it themselves rather than being told what to do when they go into a jewelry store. Here's a selection, or, seeing it on Instagram. Here's what other people are doing and what I should be doing because it's popular.
And are there any designers you've seen who you think are names that might make it onto the Antique Jewelry University site in the future?
We haven't caught up yet. We're barely to the 70s as far as
you're in the 70s, okay. Well, people have got time. And do you find that frustrating? I think I'd find that frustrating. It's like gardening. You can never finish it. You're always going to be adding to it.
Oh, I think that's great because it always gives you something to look forward to. One of my personal passions that we touched on a little bit earlier is circa 1900 because it covers so many different stylistic, endeavors at the same time. And I would love to, I don't want to call myself and say I'm going to write a book, but I think it would be really great to have all in one place things that were happening at circa 1900.
Because that's the moment that you think some of the best jewelry was created.
Oh, I definitely think a lot of the best jewelry is created, But there's some incredibly fabulous Art Deco jewelry. I would say the best jewelry was made by 1940s.
So between that sort of Belle Epoque, 1890 to 1940?
And even earlier. I mean, I appreciate beautiful old Victorian jewelry. Because look at the archaeological revival. I mean, you have all these different, very specific design trends within that time period. So it's always hard to say it's Victorian. Revival jewelry isn't Victorian. It was made in the Victorian period, So we use terms incorrectly, I think.
Is there the greatest piece of jewelry that you've handled?
I've been so fortunate to handle some really great pieces of jewelry. I think the most valuable piece of jewelry that came my way was a very special piece of jewelry, and it was a Cartier necklace that was all natural pearls, and they were very large. In between each pearl was a diamond rondelle, which is a flat bead, and it had a faceted edge. And it had a clasp with a large, I wasn't going to take it out and send it to GIA, but seemingly perfect emerald cut diamond. And the necklace was made in the 20s. And that was a really fabulous necklace.
And what was the value of it?
Probably that piece sold at we sold it at auction because that was the only place to sell natural pearls at the time. It was 25 years ago. And it's all relative. At that time, it was about $500,000.
Hopefully you'll see it again one day.
You never know. That's a piece that stood out, but there are other pieces that may not be that valuable, but that were fabulous. Absolutely fabulous.
Like what? Can you name one?
All Art Nouveau. My favorite pieces are all Art Nouveau.
Okay.
We had a piece that was about 3 inches tall, and it was made up of black opals, and it was kind of a flower with a drape down at the bottom, and it was set with lots of little tiny wires. It was all in yellow gold. The wires were all punctuated with the tiniest demantoid garnets I'd ever seen. And it was an incredible piece of jewelry. And we had it for 2 years before we sold it. It's not for everybody. Some of these pieces are they're works of art. But when people collect them, I think of this. I have pins in shadow boxes, and I put them on the wall so I can look at them. So when you're wearing a pin, you don't get to see them.
So was René Lalique your favorite designer of Art Nouveau?
Definitely one of them. Yeah.
Yes, we did a podcast a little while ago all about René Lalique's life. But any others at that time?
We had one piece that was, and unfortunately now, if that piece came in, I would have to just put it in my personal collection. But because ivory is illegal, we can't buy it or sell it. It was an ivory and gold mermaid. And she was big. She was about this big. And she was just incredible.
And what was she, on a necklace or?
It was a brooch.
It was
a lot of these pieces are brooches. But that's one piece that, both of those two pieces I just described are the kind of pieces that I should have kept them. But you can't keep everything. And I find as much pleasure really in finding a new home for someone who really appreciates and loves a piece like that than keeping it.
I want to thank you very much, Suzanne, for joining me. And not only for joining me, but thank you on behalf of all jewelry lovers for creating the Antique Jewelry University.
Well, it's been something that's been my passion and my pleasure. And if anybody has any fabulous articles that they would like to contribute, we are always looking for content to add. We're open to that. Everything that we do has been thoroughly researched. It's primary research from primary sources. So that's kind of our criteria. But it's a repository that we should all be able to contribute to.
Well, thank you. I'm sure there's some people listening who will do that.
Wonderful.
So, thank you so much, Suzanne.
Thanks, Carol. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. For this and other episodes of If Jewels Could Talk, please go to our website, carolwoolton.com/podcasts. Do share the episode any way you can, and we love to have a rating and a comment. You can find us on YouTube, and I'm at Carol Woolton on Instagram. Keep your eyes peeled. We have a book of the podcast, If Jewels Could Talk, coming out on September the 26th, published by Simon & Schuster. And join me again in 2 weeks for the next Jeweled Nugget, when I'll be talking to someone described by Vogue magazine as England's most eccentric dresser. He is a jeweled work of art himself. So join me then to hear his story. And thank you for listening. Bye-bye. If Jewels Could Talk with Carol Woolton is produced by Natasha Cowan, music and editing by Tim Thornton, graphics by Scott Bentley, illustration by Jordi Labanda. You can find our sponsors at fullygemstones.com and me at carolwoolton.com.